have this just in case anybody chooses to watch the video of the nice roundtable discussion we have. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm just going to start with some introductions before we jump in. We have a few staff members here, but then folks from a few different boards, so we just want to do names around just to make sure everyone knows who's in the room. I'm Paula Preby, I'm the planning director here. I think everyone, I know one of the few who probably knows everyone around the table, and we've got our city engineer here as well. I think he's going to take a little bit of a background role tonight, but is available for questions and stuff as we get in to some of the details about housing and infrastructure around the city and things like that. And we've got some of our friends from McKenna.
Good evening, everyone. For those I haven't met, my name is Chris Corey, and we are happy to be back, continuing to work on your master plan and help envision the future of this community. Specifically tonight, talking about housing. With me is Ethan Senti from our office, who was deeply involved in a lot of the mapping and analysis that we're going to talk about tonight, and so he's going to be demonstrating some of that.
All right, and would Commissioner, you start, and we'll just do names and then what board you represent around the room, just for everyone.
Alana Chase, Commissioner for the 3rd Ward, and Planning Commission liaison.
Jerry Schweitzer, Planning Commission. Tom Michaelman, Planning Commission.
Jake Patton, Planning Commission.
Joe Taylor, Planning Commission. Rob Verheuven, Planning Commission. Hey, Rob, how are you? Hey, Randy Smith, Zoning Board of Appeals and the DDA. Craig Gostra, Zoning Board.
Jessica Babcock, Ward 2 Commissioner.
Darren Carey, City Commission.
Ryan Mullins, CBA.
Jeff Porco, Zoning Board of Appeals. John McCracken, ZBA.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you for coming out tonight.
Yeah, now that it's so dark at night, I appreciate you coming inside here. So first, to just get us started, a little bit of what we're working on and why we're doing it. So we're in the middle of a process to add a new book to our master plan. As you can see next to Scott on the table there, our master plan is currently made up of a series of different books. There's book 1, which is an overall city, more policy-focused book. Book 2 is split into 4 pieces, and it breaks the city into neighborhood quadrants. Neighborhood clusters is what the board calls them. So there's Alpine Bristol, Northwest, South Walker, and the Standale area. And then there's another book that's got some historical planning documents as reference. And so what we're working on now is a new book 5 that will focus on housing. It's related to a new law enacted by the state legislature requiring housing to be a key element of a city's master plan. But beyond that, it's something that we've talked about a lot as boards involved with development in the city of Walker. We want to make sure we are being proactive, have good data that we're making decisions based off of, and this will be a good piece of that puzzle. So some of the purposes behind this new book is to help understand the housing market local to Walker. I know we've all heard a lot from some of the regional housing advocates that have really good data and are being really good advocates for housing in the community, but they're focused on a broader area. And so we're drilling down some of the data to Walker specifics, looking at the need for new housing in the community and doing our best to project the demand for future housing out so we can have an idea of how many housing units Walker specifically needs to be prepared for as the city continues to grow into the future. Comparing that demand to what we already have established in our master plan. Are we on track to meet that goal, or do we need to make some policy changes to fulfill what we need as a community to grow in the way that the city wants to grow? Evaluating some scenarios. So a big part of the document that we're working on and that we'll explain here tonight is a scenario planning. So looking at a few different ways that the city could go in terms of new housing development and talking about what are the highest priorities, what might not be a priority, and what changes we need to make on a policy level to the master plan, to the zoning ordinance, other things the city commission could enact, like incentive tools if they choose to, what makes sense for Walker in the direction we're trying to go. And then ultimately hoping to narrow those scenarios down to a preferred scenario and then flesh that out into an action plan. What steps do we need to take to help make sure that future housing develops in line with what we've established as our goals. So next, some of the steps in that process. First, looking at the housing supply statewide, regionally, but really looking at local numbers. So The data that's involved in the next analysis that Chris is going to talk about comes from the Census Bureau, from Esri Business Analyst, and some other large sources, but also a lot of local permit data. So we're taking the data from the Census Bureau, the American Community Survey, but then we're kind of fact-checking it, boots on the ground, against our actual permits. How many new housing, residential starts have come through the Community Development Department to really kind of truth those numbers out a little bit. Another part of the data gathering and analysis is the demand for housing and the projected demand, looking at how the city has grown in population and what we can anticipate to the best we can in terms of the future. And ultimately, the goal of that is to get to a number, which will be in the presentation tonight, of how many housing units we expect to need by 2040 in Walker, an actual number that we can break down and kind of see, are we getting close to that correct number of housing units? And then kind of move on from that data analysis to a policy analysis for the second half of this process, and look at those scenarios that I mentioned and trying to figure out, using that good data, how and where are we going to grow. So we're kind of around step 4 in this process. And Chris is going to take over for a little bit and talk through the findings of the housing needs assessment that the McKenna did for us.
Thanks, Paula. I want everyone bear with me a little bit, because I do want to go step by step about how we went through this analysis, so that when I get to the end and I give you, hey, we think this is about how many housing units you need before the year 2040, you understand how we got there. Because that is going to end up underlying everything we do from that point forward. So first of all, taking a look at your population growth, and Paula mentioned the census, and the American Community Survey, which is done by the Census Bureau on an annual basis, as far as trying to estimate population on a year-to-year basis in between their decennial head count. We've kind of come to the conclusion, and you guys aren't alone in this, that they are behind a little bit. And I don't just mean because the most recent data is from 2023. They are not capturing housing growth effectively with their surveys right now. Because if you simply look at how many housing units they said you had in 2020 and how many they said you had in 2023, and then you compare that to the number of building permits you've issued and the actual number of housing units been built, it's way off. So that was one of our first conclusions as we dove into this data, that what we needed was not their numbers, but your numbers for what's actually been built in this community. And so what this slide shows is where you were in the 2010 census, just over 23,000 people, where you were in the 2020 census, just over 25,000 people, and where we think you're going to be in 2026 based on housing that's been built or entitled or is under construction. As you note in the bottom there, this does include the Vista 45 and Lewis Farms projects that have been approved but are not quite yet started construction. It does not include the stalled English Hills and River Ridge projects, which we won't get into too much of the details on those, but they're stalled. We didn't count them. But if everything that's been entitled, under construction, et cetera, is built in 26, that we think is going to be built in 26, you're going to be at almost 28,000 people. You won't find that in the census report, but that's probably what we're looking at based on what's been built. So that's the growth that you've seen in that last 6 years. And if we take it back to 2010, you're looking at almost 20% growth in population. This breaks down that recent housing construction in terms of what type of housing it is and what year was built in, and then gives you that ongoing construction in 25 and what's been approved for 26. You can see a big jump in 26 with the big projects that have been approved. But overall, on about a 6 year basis, you're right around about 200 housing units a year that you're building, are being built in this community. As far as the breakdown in type of housing, we see 270, about a quarter-ish of the housing units have been single family, and other types are scattered through that. Multifamily at 558 being almost half. Now, that is a different ratio than has been traditionally the case in this community. That's more multifamily. Now, you may be filling a gap for multifamily that was needed. We're going to show some numbers as we go forward that we might need to rebalance that a little bit, which doesn't mean we don't need housing, but we might need to rebalance what we're getting. And that's one of the things we want to talk about today. So how do we project growth going forward? we do what we call a cohort component analysis. And I'm going to give an example of how this works before I show you what it looks like for Walker. What we do is we take the population as we understand it from the census and divide it into 10-year age cohorts. So 0 to 9, 10 to 19, all the way up to 70 to 79-year-olds and 80 plus. Then, as we move forward through time, so the 2020s, then the 2030s, we age the population up by 10 years. Then we add births based on the birth rate, and that becomes our new 0 to 9 age group. And then, morbidly, we remove deaths based on actuarial tables of how likely people are to die at a given age. And then that becomes the new population for the next 10-year period. So if you just do this, just that births and deaths, moving everybody up in age analysis, what you see is just our hypothetical city here has a population of 900 people as of 2010. As of 2020, you got 120 new kids born, but because of deaths, we're down to 887, then 881, and then we pop back up to 890 because that 120 kids that were born 20 years earlier, they've started having kids of their own. And then you see those lower age groups are going to be a little bigger. And so the population starts to come back up. But this population is stagnant. Why? Because this has the implicit assumption that nobody is moving in or out of the community. These 900 people, they're the only people that live there. They have kids and they pass away, and that's all that happens. We know that's not real life. People move in and out. So how do we account for that? That's when we bring in a migration factor. So how do we figure out a migration factor? If we started with our hypothetical city of 900 people back in 2010, and then we looked at 2020 census data and saw not 887 people, as this model would project, but 950, we'd say, oh, there are 63 more people. So a net of 63. Some must have moved out, some people moved in, and on net, we got 63 more people than we would have expected just by births and deaths, or 7.1% more. And we can use that as a factor to project going forward. Now, this is always a little tricky because we always have to kind of figure out what rate are we going to use? Are we going to use the one we think we're experiencing right now, or maybe a longer time horizon? And in order to do that, first I'll show you our 900-person city. Once we get 7.1% more people moving in, now you see the population growing, right? Now that community went from 900 to 950 to 996 to 1071. Same birth rate, same death rate, but now people are moving in. So that's how you see the population grow. This is what I was getting a minute ago. Your migration rates from 2010 to 2020 was actually negative. You had more people move out than move in that decade. Now, that's not uncommon around Michigan, right? Especially the first half of that decade, economically rough times, people moved out, and that it took a while for that to kind of work its way through the system. But 2020 to 2026, as noted previously, you are a growing community. 6.1%, more people here than our model would project just based on births. And if we take that number and we start pushing it towards 2040, we could get an idea of what that growth is going to look like. So now, let's project the population forward. We mentioned that we expect the population next year to be almost 28,000 based on the housing construction that's been approved or is underway. By the end of the decade, it's about 28.5. So it's kind of interesting there is that you have a big, and I noted it on the housing construction, you have a big chunk of housing coming in right now, right? You just approved a couple of big projects. Things are under construction. It's coming in right now. So you're going to get a big chunk of growth, and then the rest of the decade, the projection says it's actually going to be a little slower. But then by 2040, we're going to see it pick back up again, right? So we're thinking we're going to be over 31,000 people by 2040 based on current trends. It's not a linear projection because it uses that age model and all of that, but we're going to be over 31,000 people. So you're adding about 6,000 people in that 20-year stretch between 2020 and 2040, and they're going to need housing. Now, how do we estimate how much housing we need? So because that's 6,100 people, they don't need 6,100 housing units, right? We want to know how much housing they need because a 4-year-old is going to live with their parents. They don't need a housing unit, right? But a 22-year-old who just moved out of their parents' house is suddenly going to need a housing unit, even though they were probably already in your population count before, right? So there's the way that housing demand works is tied to population, but it really isn't a one-to-one relationship. So what do we use? We use what's called the headship rate. So every household has one head. If you got a family of 5, mom or dad could be the head, doesn't really matter, one of them's the head. That's a 20% headship rate, right? 1 out of 5 is the head. If you're, again, that 22-year-old living in their first apartment, it's a studio, they're by themselves, 100% headship rate for that person. So headship increases up to a certain point, then starts to decrease, and then kicks back up again at the end of life, right? So we find that 20 to 29-year-olds have about a 39% headship ratio. A lot of that's roommates or romantic partners, right? So then it's like a 50% ratio if you got 2, 33% ratio if you got 3. 59-year-olds, many of whom are starting to be empty nesters, and now we're just back to being, the empty nesting couple. Now you're at 58%. Then we also look at the home ownership rate, and that is a Michigan statewide rate of home ownership. We want to look at a broad geography because we're looking at what people want, not what their current circumstance is, but what their current desire is, right? Lots of people may be renting and want to be homeowners. Lots of people may be living in their parents' basement and want to be renters. Some people might be sitting, they might be in a home and they are burdened by this mortgage that they can't afford and they want to be renters because it's going to be cheaper for them. There's also people who have different desires. How do we get at those desires? We look at that statewide rate. So 20 to 29-year-olds, we think about 44% of them want to be homeowners. 50 to 59-year-olds, we think about 80% of them want to be homeowners. So that's how we take these rates into account, and then we say that's how we're going to estimate our demand. So based on the population projections that we're looking at, here's an example just from one of the 10-year cohorts. So as of 2020, you had about almost 3,700 30-somethings here in Walker, right? Their headship rate is about 54%, so we think they're going to demand just a little more than 2,000 housing units for those folks. Their homeownership rate is just a little under 69%, so we think that's going to be 1,376 owner-occupied, 629 rental. And we then do that for every group, and that's how we get the overall numbers. So looking at your housing demand projection, you were in 2020, you had 10,408 housing units in the city. By 2030, you're looking at needing 12,143. But now that we take a look at, all that's been built and is under construction or entitled, and in 2026, what are we looking at? We're going to have almost 12,000 housing units, which means you're actually getting close to that 2030 number already. But what happens is, as soon as we get beyond that, demand starts to demand will continue to increase. So if we were kind of rest on our laurels and say, nope, we don't need more housing, we're not going to approve any more housing, you would fall behind, right? You've kind of caught up and you're there at the moment, but you're likely to fall behind, which is why when we say, looking out to 2040, we think we need a little more than 1,200 housing units based on the model, but for the purpose of this planning exercise and this master plan, we're going to round that up a little bit. We're going to say what we think we want to aim for is about 1,500 new housing units. And that is just going to give you a little cushion. It's a little cushion to make sure you don't have to max out density on your significant undeveloped lots, for instance, and just to make sure you're kind of keeping up with demand. Notes about this number. This number is lower than you're going to hear from some housing advocates, but we'll stand by it because this is coming from your local data. It's not based on countywide. It's not based on national trends. It's not based on, trying to pitch to a bank to finance something. This is based on your local trends right now. But I also caution on the other end of the spectrum. I know you as planning commissioners sit at that dais and hear people tell you, we don't need this, we don't need this, we don't need this, because they don't want it next to them or whatever. We do need this on this scale of about 1,500 housing units over the next 15 years. So that's where that comes out. And now with that number in mind, we can start doing some planning. So I'm going to turn it back over to Paula, and she and I are going to kind of facilitate a discussion with you guys.
So this is where we're hoping to have a little bit more of an interactive conversation. Ethan's going to assist us by taking some notes. We've got one board over there with some discussion topics. Really the goal is to talk through each of these. So it says on the screen, is this important? And if so, what is the city's goal? We want to answer those questions for each of those 5 topics that make up the second set of bullet points on the board. So when we talk about housing type, that's something that comes up. I know at the Planning Commission, when we talk about housing, it comes up in all of the different planning exercises. You can think about a bunch of different housing types that we have in the city. We have predominantly like 2 or 3 different styles, and quite a lot of them, though more are out there. We have a lot of single family, detached, standalone single family homes. We've got a handful of duplexes in the city, a few small apartments, and then a bunch of big apartment complexes. There's other types of other housing unit types out there that could be options. When you think about Walker and the need for more housing in the city, something you might hear the housing advocates talk about is missing middle housing. It's something that's been coming up a lot for us professional planners, and we've been talking about it for, it's been a hot button topic for probably 15 years now. It's getting through all of the different cities and communities around the country. Think about between those single family homes and the big apartment complexes, like what's in the middle? What are the other housing options that you can think of, maybe from other communities you've traveled to or lived in?
I think that another note that's relevant here is we showed that chart, and you guys have recently built or under construction, what, a little under 300 single-family homes.
I'm gonna
A little
scroll
under-
real fast
yeah, we
here.
go back to it, and this is what Paul is talking about. Is that you had one big townhouse development, and other than that,
Waterford
you've got
Village.
is either single-family homes or big apartments, big apartment buildings, and we've heard anecdotally that you kind of feel like you're constantly getting these proposals for big apartment buildings. And there are, and then the other end of the spectrum, which is a single family home on a big lot is not affordable to a lot of people, right? Including young professionals. So where is the entry level home ownership? But this is really not supposed to be us talking. It's supposed to be a question to you guys. If you think of Walker in 2040, we think we've built 1,500 new housing units in this community. What do you want those housing units to look like? You don't let us tell you. What do you want, right? And then to the other question is, do you care? Because we don't really care is also a reasonable answer here, and that we can work with. But we want to know what is important to you guys as city leaders in this space, and what's not.
So I can say I'm sure a lot of our residents would like to see more single-family homes. Again, the issue like you brought up though is the affordability of said single-family homes to construct this one that folks want. You know, it seems like construction costs are much greater than they used to be for the ones in the 1950s, just the single ranch style or smaller ones, which ideally I think a lot of my peers would prefer. But a lot of companies aren't constructing at the moment due to the financial burden of it.
And that's fair. You also have, baked into your zoning ordinance, things like a 90-foot lot width that is required in single-family neighborhoods in this community. And I'm not criticizing it because we've been told, I've been told repeatedly in the number of years McKenna's worked here, that's part of Walker's character. We have a little bit bigger lots than our neighbors, and that's nice. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it does create that affordability issue. And because a developer's gonna say, well, if I could do 50-foot lots, I can get almost twice as many homes on the same amount of land. But I don't know that you want that, right? Or maybe you do. So that's why we're here tonight.
Yeah, I tend to, I mean, affordability is important, but of course, you know, every expensive house that is bought is pressure taken off down market, right? So,
Yeah.
I think that's important to keep in mind. But, you know, that said, I have in the past, I've known plenty of people in the past who have gotten a big leg up, owning a duplex or owning a triplex. And you obviously you can build a bunch of duplexes or triplexes that could just get bought up by rental companies, and that, you know, that may happen. But you know, what comes to mind is the Remembrance corridor there, where the plan calls for a little downtown area, and that's not at all kind of the way it's been moving. Over a bunch of townhomes or duplex, triplex, quadplex. Week 5 is the limit before it's a commercial building. Go in there, that could kind of gravitational pull toward a more walkable commercial district there as well.
So, Mark, to paraphrase what you're saying, is that some slightly more density, higher density makes sense in certain areas where we're going for that more walkable community.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
I'm less concerned about affordability because, in my mind, let developers build what
definitely find that. That shows up in the data. You see a lot, and we actually have this in the report, but we didn't put it in the presentation, is that like a lot of communities, you have a bell curve of housing costs where a big chunk of your housing is kind of in the middle of the market, but your incomes are on a spectrum. So you've got a bunch of people that are at the bottom of the spectrum that can't afford anything, and a bunch of people at the top of the income spectrum that are competing for the same housing as people who make a lot less money than them. And they're just chomping it, they're just taking it away. They're coming in with cash, right? They're
Well,
coming in
and
with
it's not
equity, and they're just pulling it out from under
individuals.
the
It's
market.
not necessarily individuals as well.
Sure.
No, that's
Yep,
fair.
that's fair.
Yeah, I'm speaking of
Certain
big market
demographics.
trends rather than certain individuals for sure. But that's a good point. But I think the other point that was made is about attainable home ownership. There's like, it's way easier. If you are a 25-year-old couple trying to buy your first place, buying half of a duplex is going to be more attainable and priced, and now you're a homeowner. Or owning a duplex and renting out the other side of it, which is really great. And now you got income stream, and the landlord is next door, not 3 states away. But again, we need to know if that's something this community actually wants to see, and where, right? Yes, and in the remembrance corridor, but not elsewhere. I mean, these are the kind of things we need to know.
So, in 2019, in this room, there was a big protest in Liver area, about 5 to 10 counties. People were adamantly against building an apartment complex there. And things to, their officials here, they got shut down. So I can tell you, there was the downtown development meeting, what was that, last week, Paul?
Yeah,
Central
Central Stanville open house.
Yeah, a lot of people are against these high density apartments, adamantly. Now, 2 things come to mind. I'm just gonna play devil's advocate here. What if we don't grow? I mean, people don't want more housing units. And the people that live here, I mean, they giggle, they care, we all care, because we're sitting here right now. The other thing I think about is, what if we do want to grow? And construction costs have gone up 43% from 2020 to 2025. And that's affordability, so, I don't know, it seems to me it's just kind of a conundrum. I know that people that live in Walker really don't want more high density apartments. And there's Westtown, I think it's right over here across the street from Meyer. I've heard people say, we don't want to create that mistake again. I didn't really know what that meant. I drove through there, and it's not very walkable. So I think that there's a sweet spot there somewhere that we can, maybe it's more duplexes or townhouses. And I think that the people that are adamant, the non-growth people, I'll call them, would be warming up to more growth if there was more walkability and more green space. I just read about what Grand Rapids is doing. They call it the GR, or Grand Rapids Bridge to Our Future. And they're talking about more townhouses, more walkability, more interconnectivity. So I just became aware of that today. And so I just quickly jotted down some notes, but I was kind of wondering if anybody's looked at that and seen if we can't coattail on what's going on there. They are experimenting in different parts of Grand Rapids. There's the $9 million Oxford Trail project. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. Yeah, it's part of an overall $55 million plan.
No.
There's,
I'm with the city, but
yeah,
yeah,
right,
yeah.
I didn't mean to black you out, but I just don't, it seems to me to be a good idea to take a look at what GR is doing and if we can coattail. I mean, we share water and sewer, it seemed like something there would work.
The design
it's such a powerful financing tool, but it also is, the city is foregoing a lot to do it. But for saying like, we're not gonna open the whole city up, we're just gonna open up this for this, the stuff that we say we want in the location we want, that's our housing brownfield policy. It's just a thought, but that's one tool in your toolbox now, you can use that.
And as we move through this overall planning process, tonight is one meeting. I'm really gonna try to keep us focused on going through the different topics and these goals to get some good feedback, and we'll dig a lot more into the mechanisms, the tools in the city's tool belt, and how we make that action plan workable in a future meeting, probably in January or February. So I'm gonna keep us in, and so housing type, if you didn't get a say, jump back into that, but we're also gonna open it up for neighborhood design. When you think about like subdivisions with curvilinear streets or traditional neighborhoods with blocks, are we talking about like what are the amenities that make a neighborhood where you want to see a new neighborhood be if a project comes in? What does it have as components that make you go, this is a really good Walker project?
Okay, you guys are talking, walkability's come up a couple times, but I'm interested to hear what that means for walkers specifically, right? Because there's a really wide spectrum of the type of walkability you can have, and we know when we don't see it, right? We know when we walk out of the apartment complexes at West Town, and there's no sidewalks, and there's busy roads surrounding, and really there's nowhere to walk to. But we know we see it when like in downtown Grand Rapids or something like that, but that isn't walkable. So there's a middle ground somewhere, but we need to kind of define it for us, right? Is walkability access to the Standale Trail without having to cross a busy road? Is it access to a school or a park? Or someone once told me that one measure of walkability is, can you go to an ice cream joint, get an ice cream cone, and walk home before it melts? And if that's true, then you live in a walking neighborhood. So, I mean, is that our metric? Like, so what do you guys, what does walkability mean to walk?
Yeah, on the housing types, I think about this, like I like the map and how you kind of showed the 1,500 units. I mean, that made a lot of sense. You know, if that's to inform the kind of housing that we think about, if you take that literally, it's 1,500 this 10 years, and then it's 3,000 in 20, and if you literally
build new housing, there's certain corridors we may want to avoid because they're not built for that traffic level, or they don't have water and sewer, or something of that nature. And so that's another kind of piece of this puzzle, right? Is where it makes sense to put things. Chris?
So, couple comments. One, right now, if you're entry level getting into the housing market, I would really have a difficulty coaching someone, encouraging someone to buy a home in town. The rental would be
and also people be able to get there. But a metric like that we can evaluate and we can say, these are the neighborhoods where that's true, and these are the neighborhoods where it's not true, and what can we do to make it true? Like, do we need a bike path? Do we need a new park? Do we need, I mean, what would connect these people, right? A road diet on some of the roads.
But these questions that you're posing, I didn't know what was gonna happen when I walked in here tonight. But I'd really like a chance to digest some of these questions, so when we reconvene, I can speak more intelligently. I would have to look at my statistics on my phone.
Well, we are gonna assign homework at the end of the meeting, and we'll reconvene in a couple of months.
And we just want to open it up, because we want to get through all of these and make sure we have time for the rest of the presentation and respect your time. So we've already veered a little bit into transportation and mobility. That's, think about the road network and where it's really busy and where it's not, where it might make sense to add more housing, where it's kind of over capacity. But also we're talking about the walking, the transit, thinking about where the bus lines are, where the liquor line stops is something the city's taken into account in the past, higher density around that transit line. So are those sorts of things priorities for the city moving forward? And then the final one, we'll just open it up to all of these, is economic and fiscal impact. So balancing new tax base with the cost of providing services and infrastructure. So when we're thinking long-term and getting into some of the scenarios, if we're developing greenfield areas or talking about expanding more housing in the South Walker as potential options, some of them come with higher infrastructure costs. We might need to expand water and sewer and upgrade major roads. And what's the balance? Are we thinking about all of those things up front? Are those priorities? Are some higher priorities than others? Kind of the floor is open. We've probably got about 7 more minutes to have this conversation, and then we'll move on to the rest of the boards and circle back to open conversation at the end if people need to take off. So any other things specifically on the transportation or economic impact?
Well, on transportation, neighborhood design comes into play in terms of providing non-motorized. Basic one is sidewalk. And you get into the hierarchy and get into connection to trails, to transit.
We've got some great trails. We'll make sure those connections are there. Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of it, and another part is the safety of it. If we have major roads, making allowance for safe crossings on those roads so that people can feel comfortable, and because it may be a necessity, because they may not have access to the auto as most people may have. And so all those factors I think have to be taken into account.
Anybody haven't heard?
I'm about 90 years old, but I came here in '68 with 3 little girls at a farm I'd never seen, and I made a down payment on it. And that's where, and then since then I bought land
usage, or, you know, you can't. So there's certain ways that we can discourage that, or encourage making sure at least one of the 2 units is owner occupied. Or try to encourage, you know, people to use the ADU for grandma or a 22-year-old or cousin Joey, right? Which is actually how they tend to be used anyway. They're not, it is, people do build them and rent them out, but more commonly they build them for extended family members or friends that need a place to live. And now they create something that's quality within their own property. Yes?
All right, this might be free fall, but, the DDA had a study done a few, Scott, remember this? On the M45 corridor, we overpaid for all that, remember that? Was that pre-fall or not? So there is some stuff that maybe the DDA could share, or maybe they have, about the M45 corridor and traffic calming, right? And at crossings, little safety islands, I don't know
Yeah.
the terminology, Scott.
Yeah, I think the big part was the access management, but then we looked and explored crossings and things like that
So
as
that,
potential amenities for the DDA.
yeah, so the DDA has this, or we pay for it, or we've done it, I don't know if it's been shared with, or if we wanna resurrect that at some point and let you guys look at that, I'm just throwing that out there. But it kinda addressed a lot of the stuff that we've been throwing out, transportation and connectivity and crossing, safely crossing the interstate there on 11 and 45.
You know, since we're getting into that category, we had a really interesting meeting today with the Grand Valley Metro Council and discovered that over the last 3 years, the non-motorized accidents causing serious injury and fatality are up dramatically. And a lot of people were kind of scratching their heads. I think the real reason is because the conflict points that we've created and the amount of people using non-motorized transportation has gone up dramatically. So I'm not sure that we're seeing more frequencies per person or per trip. I think we're just seeing way more trips. And if you've looked around, I know in Walker especially, we see a lot more people riding bikes to work. We see a lot more people using it as transportation, not just recreation. So that seems to be up in other communities too. So as we do those kinds of things, you're gonna see a new scrutiny, a greater scrutiny from the folks that have to put their names on them to do everything we possibly can to make them as safe as possible.
So Scott, last year, where the trail crosses Leonard, there was for a while like an island,
Right?
and that was incredible. I crossed that on foot every morning, and depending on what day of the week it is and how early or how not early I am, it's challenging sometimes to get across Leonard. And I know that there was a sign that said this is just a test or and I thought it was incredible. Obviously it was not deemed successful, or at least we discontinued it.
I love that you're throwing me this softball because it's perfect, right?
Get it out of the park.
We had bid out a project to build 3 of those, and one of them is at that location. They'll get constructed next spring. There'll be one on Kinney where we have a crossing at Waldorf, across from, close to John Kinney's old farm, if you know where that is. And then we'll have another one on Remembrance Road down by Justin, which is in front of the daycare where this Fred Meyer Standale Trail crosses. So we were very fortunate to kind of slide in with a last minute grant opportunity. Those kinds of things happen to us because they know that we'll deliver and we'll end up having a great project in the end. And we're gonna have 3 more of those. We have 3 more that we could do on the south part of the city that we'd like to use this as a springboard for to get to next.
Great.
All right, before we wrap this up, any final comments, especially from the folks we haven't heard much from yet? Just want to make sure there's room for every voice in the room. Yeah, okay.
I was impressed by this entire layout. I will have to make a note to self to bring a magnifying glass.
We do
but I'm here to listen.
All right, well, thank you everyone for participating. I know we've got some good notes on the board, and we can keep adding things if other things come up, but we're gonna move on to get through the final portion of our presentation, which is getting into the different housing scenarios. So what McKenna and the staff team have prepared so far, and at the end of the evening, you will all get a binder that has the draft document in it that goes into the housing needs assessment and all of these scenarios in great detail. You can review them and have that more time to kind of digest some of the information. So we're gonna give a super high overview, and then we're gonna walk through each of these 5 scenarios that we've prepared. We've got maps and some images on the screen to give an overview. So there are 5 scenarios that are broken down in some detail in the document that's been prepared so far. They all use our current master plan's future land use map as a base. And I know you've got a copy of that. There's some of them around. And so that document, that master plan, future land use map, has density and residential tied to it. And so you can see there's residential growth areas at 2 to 4 units per acre, or 4 to 8 units per acre, or residential existing density where areas where we feel like we don't want to add more density. So that is the underlying map through the rest of this document. I'm gonna give a super high level here, and then Ethan's gonna talk in a little more detail about the analysis that went into preparing all of the scenarios. So there are 5 key scenarios. The first one is the passive scenario. That's kind of how we've been going about things so far here in Walker. We have a master plan that has a future land use map and the community character map that gives guidance to development and rezonings. We have a zoning ordinance that puts some regulations around things, but it's a little bit what comes in from the market is what we review. If it gets approved, it gets built. There is forethought in the master plan, but no further real guidance. We're not seeking out projects. We're not vetting them any farther than do they align with our current master plan. So it's a market-driven, no like proactive actions taken approach. The second one is significant undeveloped lots. That's something that's already in our master plan. These are the kind of large greenfield properties that seem like you drive by and you're like, that seems like it's gonna develop anytime now. As an example, the Vista 45 site behind Meyer on Sandale was a significant undeveloped lot, and it recently had a large project approved. So these are larger scale projects, and they would steer development to those large greenfield areas and leave the existing neighborhoods largely unchanged. The third option, the scenario, is the mixed use overlays. Our zoning ordinance already has 3 overlay districts, one in Standale, one in Remembrance, kind of at the Remembrance Leonard corner, and then one on Alpine, south of the highway. And those have additional regulations focusing on bringing buildings closer to the road and going up, adding some commercial or office, and then residential above. So they're using that mixed-use building typology, increased density, but in places that already have infrastructure, might be those closest we have in Walker to those walkable nodes, adding housing to areas where there's already a business district. Fourth option is what we're calling gentle density. It might sound familiar because there was a version of this discussed 2-3 years ago. And this focuses on small infill, existing neighborhoods that might have large lots that could be split or vacant lots spread around. So there's not talking big projects, but if the city were to, you could prioritize the small infill development, deprioritize the large projects, and steer future growth into those small onesie-twosie projects. The final one is South Walker. This is the biggest lift of the board, but we wanted to have it as an option for discussion. If the city were to choose to, we could invest in South Walker in terms of infrastructure, focusing on where there already is water or sewer, adding it if needed, and thinking about if that part of the city were to develop, what would that look like in a way that's appropriate for Walker as it wanted to grow? So these are all hypothetical scenarios, but they've been run through the master plan and run through an analysis to give us information of what it would look like if the city were to choose these as options moving forward.
In all these cases, it's dialing the scenario up to 100. So it's like, if 100% of all new housing went in this scenario, which is obviously unrealistic, but in order to give you guys an idea of, okay, the different ways that you could build out, that's why we kind of.
What the impact of those scenarios would
What would
be.
the impact be? What would the Walker of 2040 look like if we did this? So then you can use them to dial, hey, we want to do this one 30%, this one 20%, and that'll
Yep.
hopefully help you make these decisions.
There's a few scenarios that we discussed but didn't analyze in great detail. These were reviewed and then kind of set aside maybe for the future. One of them is accessory dwelling units, and that was excluded based on previous public planning processes in which that was not chosen as a key way forward, and so it was kind of overlooked in this. Also, you can't get to that 1,500 number with just ADUs. The second is shopping center redevelopment. Think of our big strip malls and big box stores. You'll see communities saying, we're gonna tear down that mall and build a whole new neighborhood where the mall used to be. We've seen some resiliency in our major shopping corridors, and this doesn't seem like a likely thing in the near term, so it wasn't pursued in great detail. Adaptive reuse is another one that was reviewed and discarded for this project, and that looks at transitioning existing buildings that were not residential to residential. Think about office buildings and hotels, converting them into apartments or condos. There's some interest in that out in the world right now. There are, hot button projects you'll see. It's not really something we anticipate being a big deal in Walker in the near term, and so this is distinct from that gentle density I talked about, because this is more, maybe this whole block of single-family homes gets demolished to build some new type of housing. That's not something that really seems to fit with who Walker is and where we want to be, so it wasn't pursued in greater detail now. But if any of these are things that you think really need to be analyzed in more detail, we can talk about that. But at this time, so we chose 5. These 4 are not reviewed in more detail at this time. So before we go in and Chris and I walk in each of those 5 scenarios in great detail, I'm going to hand it over to Ethan for a minute, and he is going to talk through what all went into the analysis that you're going to see.
Yeah, sure. So at the risk of kind of getting in the weeds a little bit on this very in-depth GIS analysis we did, we wanted to just talk about the methodology that we used to create the maps and the subsequent estimates of the impacts on the community. So to get the most accurate picture of the likelihood of development of all these different parcels throughout the city, we looked at a bunch of different factors that you can see up on the screen there. So we looked at proximity to utilities, we looked at lot size, we looked at what type of corridor a particular parcel is on, whether that's a higher traffic one or something a little bit more local or neighborhood streets. We looked at future land use categories, so going back to the master plan, the original master plan map, and then also transit proximity, steep slopes, and flood hazards. So what we did is we fed all of these different factors into our model, and we assigned a development probability to each of those different criteria for each parcel. And that allowed us to kind of, once we aggregated all those scores and weighted them according to how important a particular criteria is to a certain scenario, we were able to spit out whether or not that lot was going to be a high likelihood for development or a medium or low potential for development. So once we got that kind of basic score, we split up our observed range into the 3 different categories, and those parcels got dumped into the appropriate category, which is what you're going to see across all these maps. And then that data enabled us to make the estimates about how these different scenarios are going to impact different facets of the community. So what your population is going to look like if all your high likelihood parcels are developed versus all your high and your medium and low. So we looked at, Chris and Paula will get more into the specifics, but we looked at population, we looked at how it's going to impact your school districts, infrastructure, and of course housing. And all of those impacts are included in the final document that you're going to see.
Yes, there are size ones in
Yes.
the handouts that you'll all get. It's up there as a reference, not to be read, yep.
Yes.
Yep.
No,
Okay, so I think this will make more sense.
Bigger next.
Yep, everything Ethan just described will make more sense as we get in, so I'm just gonna move right on to the first scenario, which is the passive scenario. So, once again, this is the one where we're not taking proactive actions to steer residential development in any direction. This is, we have a master plan, what comes in, we review, if it meets the ordinance, it moves forward. And based on that, again, this is a reference, there is a full size there, and we'll be able to, look at them all. This is what the analysis that Ethan described showed up in the GIS when we look at the passive scenario. So the drivers for this type of development, where is there water and sewer to support that development? Where is there land that's readily available to be developed? Especially if they're on major roadways, they might be prioritized and in line with the future land use map. So the darker parcels are the high probability ones, the ones that we are more likely to see redeveloped under the scenario in the near term. The more fuchsia colored ones are the medium and low likelihood, the medium, and then the ones that aren't highlighted are unlikely to change in any way, housing-wise, based on this scenario. And what we see when we go through the analysis with this one is that the highest likelihood, if all 100% of the highest likelihood parcels were developed, based on the density allowance in the master plan, we would anticipate around 650 housing units created through this passive scenario. If you add in the potential, those medium and lower likelihood ones, that's 3,000. So cumulatively, if the passive scenario, we just kept going as we were, not making any changes, we are likely to far exceed that 1,500 housing unit number by the passive scenario. But what we've seen so far is that of the goals that we've just discussed, what we want to see in development, we're not always getting through this process. So we would get housing units, but they might not be the ones we want to see most. And so that begs the question, if we were to steer development, what other possibilities are out there? How could we steer development to get different types, more diverse housing units, more of that neighborhood design that we want to see, and meet the housing needs goal that we've established? So I'm going to hand it off to Chris to talk about the next two, and I'll be back. But got a large map here looking at the significant undeveloped lots.
Yeah, do you mind if I speak from over here, and I'll just...
Yep.
So the significant undeveloped lots, as Paul mentioned, are identified in the current master plan in Book 1, and they are the large parcel greenfield development sites available within the city. You may notice on the passive map, it's hard to see from back room, but you'll see it in the booklet, there are actually a lot of small parcels on here. There are a whole bunch of purple parcels on here that are probably gonna get one house, and that's fine. But it's not moving the city in any sort of direction, right? It's just sort of how stuff gets built in places. What this could do is more focus development in specific locations so you can get the type of development that you want, that you can get that neighborhood design you want, or the housing type you want, and get to your housing goal, or what the market is demanding in terms of housing. Can you go to the next slide? So just calling out, hey, what's purple on here? For Sluice Orchards, we know, that property owner, last I heard, is not particularly motivated to sell, but that flags in our analysis as very high likelihood for development. It is on M45 Lake Michigan Drive. It's near other development. It's a solid size parcel. It's relatively flat. It's very developable. So thinking about what should that look like if and when that develops is something we will do in this process. Another one, Richmond Farms. Interestingly, the northern half flags as more likely than the southern half. And we can maybe explore why that is, Ethan, but either way, that is a huge piece of property, right? Right in the middle of your largely developed area, industrial kind of on one side, residential on the other, but it has transportation challenges. Because Richmond Street is a fine road, but it's not really a high capacity roadway. So something to think about. And then the other thing is, next slide. With this scenario, your high likelihood, the or could not do to keep it in the pink and not make it purple. So these are the scenarios we want to talk
Show
about.
us what the cross streets are there.
Yeah, so this is O'Brien right here.
Okay.
This is Lake Michigan Drive, so this is Lewis Orchards. This is that hundreds of acres on the south side of O'Brien that have not been developed. Could be, or we could discourage. It's kind of up to this process where that goes. That's Leonard, that's Richmond, that's 3 Mile. You see the highway here. So hopefully that gives you some idea about where the remaining significant undeveloped lots are. The list of these is smaller than it was in 2020 when we first created it, because as Paul pointed out, several of them have been developed. Most recently, Vista 45, or it's, it is in process, it's being under construction soon. So next scenario is the mixed-use overlay scenario, which is the next 2 maps here. So the zoning ordinance calls out the areas you see in pink on this map as mixed-use overlays and allows developers to build multi-story mixed use in an urban walkable configuration. Talk about some nodes of walkability. Your master plan, your zoning ordinance already call for them in this location. The zoning ordinance allows very high density, but if you notice, none of the lots on here are purple, because none of them flagged in our analysis as high likelihood of development. Why? Because they're already built on. They're already developed, they're already active businesses, that kind of thing. So any developer who wants to build on them is going to have to buy out existing tenants, tear down buildings, put in all that upfront cost. Now, in a scenario like this, if you were to turn this all the way to 100, right, and which again, is that realistic? Probably not. But if we turn it all the way to 100 just for a thought exercise, what you're talking about is all 1,500 of those housing units we talked about go here, here, and here, and nowhere else. The rest of the city doesn't get touched. But these areas are going to be 4, 5, and 6-story buildings in clusters that are internally walkable. So, is that great? Is that scary? Is a little bit of that okay? That's for this process to think about. And again, it's got upsides and downsides, and that's why we'll look at each of these. Paul, are you going to take the next one then?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, so there's one more note. That is actually, I say 1,500 housing units, but actually if all of this got built out to the highest density that the zoning ordinance allows, it wouldn't reach 1,500 units. What does that say, about 900 or so?
Yeah, it's 956
It's
here,
956.
but that's the 1,500.
So that's actually an important takeaway, is that you can't rely entirely on your mixed-use nodes, because there actually isn't enough land here under the current density allowances to build all the housing you need. Doesn't mean it can't contribute, especially if you want these to build out as walkable nodes, but it does mean it's not the entire solution.
And this is a potential way that, as Chris was describing earlier, potentially the housing brownfield program could help if you wanted to incentivize and say, we are going to prioritize mixed-use redevelopment in one of these areas and make that the boundary and that type of housing to allow some more of that affordable workforce type housing. This would be one of the ways that that could make sense. The next scenario is the gentle density, and this is hard to see on the large scale map. It relies on the current infrastructure we have and focuses on small projects. These are 1, 2, maybe up to 4 unit developments, possibly, but these are individual lots, many of them single family on existing roads, that would make sense. And again, hard to see, but you'll see it more in the printout, and that there's a mix of the purple and the fuchsia colored lots in here. Some are highly likely to be developed, some less so. The resulting development from this, if this were a key approach, focuses on major corridors where we already have road infrastructure to support more housing, utility infrastructure to support more housing, but they're small projects, and it would leave some of those larger, possibly those significant undeveloped lots or other parcels, if we focused here, leave some of that for the more rural character that Walker has historically been known for, by saying we want to develop where we already have infrastructure and not in areas where we don't. But interestingly, it's not spread across the whole city, as you can see here in South Walker, south of Riverbend. Oh, here's Riverbend, here's Hall. So south of O'Brien, there are no parcels that are flagged by this calculation, the gentle density. None of these parcels meet the criteria to be even medium likely to be redeveloped in this way. And you'll see that collectively, cumulatively, they get us pretty close, but this scenario alone, even if dialed all the way up to 100, would not meet the housing needs that we've established, but it could be a tool in the toolbox. And the final version is South Walker. This is not meant to scare anyone. This is a thought exercise. If the city were to, say a large mega project were to move forward and it did help bring infrastructure, water and sewer into South Walker, and all of a sudden there's more development pressure on the city to say, we want to develop around this potential large, maybe say an aquarium. What would we want to have in place to say, here's how we want to develop? It would require some major changes. There's not a lot of, in our ordinance, a lot of development is not allowed in these areas. So we would need to bring in water and sewer. We would probably need to upgrade the road network. Some amendments to the master plan and zoning ordinance. Some rezoning would need to take place to allow higher density where most of South Walker is currently zoned agricultural that requires 1 acre lots. That's unlikely to generate very high density development by nature, but there might be places that would want to be changed to upgrade some of that. So here's what flags in the analysis, some parcels more likely to develop than others, and again would require some significant investment from the city, would concentrate all of the future development in these areas that haven't had that before. The O'Brien corridor, Wilson and Butterworth are some of the roads that would see a lot of change. And it would exceed, so here's that 1,500 target number. You get pretty close just with the high likelihood, but this is a scenario, again, it has a very heavy lift, might not be likely, but doing the exercise of planning, thinking about it in case things were to move in a direction that brought that utility infrastructure from the outside, thinking about how that would impact in the document, goes into detail and say, how would this change some of our areas? Where would we see the biggest change? What roads would need to be changed? How would this impact our wards and our school districts and other things? So this is now a comparison of all of the 5 scenarios, passive, significant undeveloped lots, overlays, gentle density, and South Walker against the target, saying, we could meet that goal lots of different ways. We're unlikely to dial any one of these up to 100, but maybe it's pieces of 2 when we prioritize some things over others to get to that number and get the good development that we really want to see. Thank you, Mark.
Sorry, I gotta run.
I think right now I'm going to open it to some general comments and conversation and feedback. When you hear about these scenarios, what rises to the top? What are the questions or comments you have right off the bat?
I think it's a combination of these things, definitely.
Yeah.
And I would not be opposed to accessory dwelling units. You got some really big lots in Walker. And I just think that we'd have to be very careful and vet each and every one regarding zoning rules. Grand Rapids is going through, aren't they, Jake? They're going through a revamp of the zoning rules. That's what I read about.
They are. They're early days.
They
And
hired a consultant and it wasn't us.
Yeah. Sorry. But, yeah, I know that Grand is all for ADUs. And you know what? In select situations, I am too. And maybe put the rules in place that, I know that it's hard to not enforce 100%, but if you get 90% enforcement, that the owner lived in that house where the ADUs, that expanded garage, but they tie in the utilities together. I just think it's a mix. It's gonna be a mix.
Andy.
So one type of housing we haven't talked about is manufactured housing. How's that feel? So we have 2 manufactured home developments, correct? In Walker, or am I missing one? Or
There
it
are-
might be another one.
There are 3.
But there's 2 on Wilson,
Yep.
okay?
2 adjacent to each other that have different owners, but then you've got a small one over off of Bristol.
Yep.
So my point is, I think we need to open this up to repurposing those things. For example, we got Apple Tree, which pretty much, I don't know about the history there, the police reports, all that, but I would imagine it's a little bit different
says your master plan must address the housing needs of your community in order to be a valid master plan.
So they kind of leave it open.
They leave it
Yep.
pretty open. They have provided more tools to help finance. They've provided, some more data type tools, and that kind of thing. So that they're doing a lot to try to get projects off the ground on the developer side. And cities can kind of manipulate and move that funding with their own policies, and that's what we want to get to down the line with this project is what tools do you want to use and what do you not want to use and what do you incentivize and not. But they're not really, it's not like the city's telling us, the 1,500 housing units, for instance, is not coming from the state. It's us trying to evaluate the market. We're just trying to react to the market so that you're not over your skis one way or another vis-a-vis what people want to build or
So
live in.
does your funding follow any particular,
There are a few mechanisms for different types of housing. MISHDA, the state housing agency, runs different programs to try to get different types of housing moving and stimulate, the housing market to build more of different types, with mixed success. But I don't know that looking to the state is gonna give us a ton of guidance here. We're really trying to focus on how Walker wants to grow. And then once we know kind of that target or which types of scenarios might make sense, then we'll go into what are the tools in our toolbox, what are the levers the city can pull to incentivize some development over other development. When I say incentivize there, I don't mean just financial incentives. I mean, upzoning things or downzoning them, changing what the master plan says in the future land use map to say this parcel can't be redeveloped to 4 units an acre, it's limited to 2, or, there are those sorts of levers the city can pull. And so we're still trying to get to that guidance of where we want to go. And then once there's some consensus there, we say, how do we get there and build out that action plan for the city to have a plan and take those steps to get the development we want to see.
thank you.
Just one last thought. We've been talking about Grand Rapids, our neighbors to the east. How about our neighbors to the west with Tellme? It's just in a concept. When we think about it, we got that big apartment project right here, I don't remember, it's 3 Mile.
Kensington.
Reserve. Tellme's kind of spot zone their stuff. Maybe I'm picking on them, but think about that. With that big old thing, that's a really nice place. And people love to live there. All ages. The other thing that I was thinking was, now there's another one gonna go on. They got a nice 48 or 50 unit building on Leonard Street right across. It's in the Talmadge Township too on the south side. So I don't know. Everybody's looking at this multifamily and this density. Talmadge is kind of doing it on our corridor.
Yeah. So Walker has tried, there have been efforts made through our master plan to focus when big housing developments are gonna come in, focus on where there's, larger corridors. You see that, where it makes sense, like along Lake Michigan Drive. But
We've tried to collaborate with them, a lot. They just don't have the horsepower we have, and we don't have the horsepower Grand Rapids has, so we're kind of right in the middle.
All right, it's after 8, so I want to respect everyone's time. We're going to just go through the kind of next steps here and then stick around for discussion. If people want to keep talking, we'll keep taking feedback and notes, and it's the right time for you to head out and live the rest of your day. That's also fair, totally fair. I appreciate everyone's time and attention tonight. So the next steps moving forward is everyone is going to get one of these binders. It has the draft document that we've prepared to date. And at the beginning, before it, there's a little cover letter asking some questions to think about as you go through the document. And that will help guide feedback moving forward into future meetings. So at this time, we're looking at January for the next meeting for this kind of joint working group to get back together, to focus in more on the goals of the city and the scenarios that make sense, trying to craft the primary way forward. And ultimately, once that's done, we'll have a final version of this document, and whatever that final scenario is, if there are changes that need to be made to the rest of the master plan to align with that final goal, that'll be part of this process as well. We'll amend those other books so that there is a consistency throughout the entirety of our master plan. it has to go through the standard state master plan approvals process, which takes 2 to 3 months, because there's a 63-day waiting period in the middle to give time for the public to respond, and then hopefully adopt the final version and start taking some of those active steps. Thank you, Mayor. To pursue those goals and make that planned vision a reality. So are there any questions about the process right now? You all have a document. So once again, thank you for your time and your attention. I appreciate all of the good feedback that we got, and hopefully you now understand the layout of the document before you and can review it at your own time. I know everyone loves homework, and hopefully come back to the next meeting with a good understanding of the framework that's been put in place and participate in that kind of vision casting and how we get to that housing goal for Walker and incentivize the type of development that we most want to see. And if there are people on the boards that you talk to that aren't here, I will have the other books. We'll make sure to get them to everyone, and it will be going up online as the draft. You can share with other folks as well.
So what is the homework?
It's on the cover sheet. If you look at the first cover sheet, there's some questions. It's really, we want to encourage you to review the document and think through some of those particular questions. Yep, those bullet points there that will help guide you thinking through to be set up for the January meeting.
And Paul,
We haven't set it yet, working on it. I'll let you know probably in early December what that date is.
Paula, we thank you for all your efforts. Obviously, we've got differing opinion around here. I'm sure the public's got just as many, that's what we wanna hear. There's some good news about, somebody mentioned the 8 units dispersed sounded pretty good to me. Rather than having a whole bunch of them together, but that's what we wanna talk about, that's good. I don't want it in my backyard, but that's all right.
I've got a large backyard, so. All right, yes, Jack.
Deer hunting's pretty good out there, you know?
I'm reserving my words, and I'm gonna say right now, overall, this looks like a very rural city. In general, it's balanced out in good proportions as it is, and Walker should stick with that kind of scenario. Balance it, but keep it feeling rural.
All right, do we want to officially?
Yeah, we've got a quorum here, so, make this official.
Support.
So moved.
Got a motion and support. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, same sign.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks for being here, Scott.
What's that?
Thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you. I know we've been in a lot of meetings together, but I never really had a chance